Good afternoon. My name is Joel Hewitt, and I am a subject matter expert at the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, or HDIAC. We are pleased to present today's webinar on defining the profile of potential cyber criminals, and we thank you for attending. Today we have two esteemed presenters from Norwich University and Michigan State, and we will introduce them further momentarily. Please note that we are recording this webinar. The video webcast will be available for download from our website tomorrow. You will also be able to download the slide deck at the end of the presentation today, and it too will be available tomorrow at HDIAC.org. And one other note, the chat function in the top right-hand corner is now enabled. So please feel free to type in any questions you have as we go along. We will collate these questions and answer them and any others during a question and answer session at the end, or one of our presenters may answer them as we go. And finally, I'll share with you a bit of background information on our center first. We are a Department of Defense sponsored entity, one of three information analysis centers, or IACs. Organizationally, we fall under the Defense Technical Information Center, known as DTIC, and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our mission is to be the go-to R&D, S&T, and RDT&E leader within the Homeland Defense and Security community. We achieve this by providing timely and relevant information, superior technical solutions, and quality products to the DoD and HDS COIs and COPs. In doing so, we are able to help solve the most challenging technical problems facing the government and military. We pursue this mission across 8 focus areas: alternative energy, biometrics, CBRN defense, critical infrastructure protection, cultural studies, homeland defense and security, medical, and weapons of mass destruction, or WMD. Our external subject matter expert network is a critical tool in how we achieve this mission. Both of our presenters today are HDIAC member SMEs. And HDIAC's network is quite extensive, and we have a fairly small staff, so we do rely on the support of our partners and outside SMEs. So if you are interested in joining us and have expertise in one or more of our 8 focus areas, please visit our website and apply. Or feel free to contact me directly. My contact information will be up on the screen at the end of the presentation. So it should come as no surprise to anyone who reads the news or has an internet connection that one of the Department of Defense's top priorities right now is boosting the military's cybersecurity and cyber defense capabilities. DoD has recognized the growing importance of cyber defense for some time now. In 2000, for instance, the Joint Staff noted that information was itself part of the battle space and key to attaining, quote, full spectrum dominance. In 2009, the capstone concept for joint operations really cemented the status of cyberspace as the 5th warfighting domain, joining land, sea, air, and outer space. Just this past January, Secretary Mattis presented the unclassified summary of our new National Defense Strategy. It explicitly emphasizes the importance of cyberspace to the joint force. The new strategy mentions the word cyber in some form or another more than twice as often as the previous defense strategy from 2008, while it's also about a quarter of the length. And so, with apologies to Sun Tzu, it is essential that DoD and our nation's law enforcement agencies know our enemy. Understanding an adversarial threat is the first step to defeating it. Importantly, the operative word for this study and our webinar discussion today is potential. As our presenters will explain further, the population of computer users who responded to Colonel Hyslip's and Dr. Holt's survey identify themselves as hackers. But we are not seeking to make any kind of legal judgment on them. More to the point, guaranteeing their anonymity in responding to the survey to begin with was an absolute must to gain their cooperation. Recently, collaborating with hackers, or potential cybercriminals, has risen in prominence within both DoD and non-military commercial communities. In June 2016, Ash Carter, who was then Secretary of Defense, kicked off the Hack the Pentagon initiative, a so-called bug bounty program. Hack the Pentagon invited hackers to legally test DoD systems to find vulnerabilities. 250 participants engaged in the first pilot program, and they tagged a total of 138 legitimate vulnerabilities. And collectively, DoD paid out about $70,000 to the hackers who participated. The Pentagon, though, is not the only federal entity keen on the benefits of collaborating with hackers to promote the public good. Also in 2016, the Assistant Attorney General for the DOJ's Criminal Division noted that it was, quote, a laudable way to help computer security researchers use their skills in an effective, beneficial, and lawful manner. News reports from earlier this week indicate that the State Department as well is considering starting its own bug bounty program. So, do we call them just hackers, independent computer security researchers, or potential cybercriminals? Part of the confusion in terminology is due to the fact that an individual can be engaged in multiple types of hacking work. But furthermore, this indeterminate language is the result of a fundamental lack of knowledge about hacking subculture. So who are hackers? What are their motivations? Are they driven by individual ideologies mostly, or do they adhere more to group behavior patterns? To what extent do they fit the stereotype of the unemployed and not so socially graceful 20-something male? Colonel Hyslip and Dr. Holt's findings indicate that this set of the hacking population discussed today is more highly educated than one might expect. A majority of them have completed education beyond high school in a population that skews young to begin with. This is but one example of how this study sheds critical light on how to think about a culture that is unique and otherwise impenetrable to outsiders. Now to introduce our presenters. Our first speaker today is Colonel Thomas Hyslip, currently an adjunct professor at Norwich University in the College of Graduate and Continuing Studies. Moreover, Colonel Hyslip is a federal agent in the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, or DCIS, as well as an officer in the U.S. Army Reserve. Dr. Thomas J. Holt is a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. His research focuses on computer hacking, malware, cybercrime, and policy responses to these threats. He has published widely in peer-reviewed journals and has authored multiple books. And with that, we turn it over to our presenters.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Tom Hyslip, and thank you, Joel, for the background on HDIAC and the nice introduction. So before we begin this presentation, I wanted to give you a little bit of background for those that are not aware. As Joel said, this was a survey of potential cyber criminals. Specifically, we surveyed users of what are called stressors or booters. They're an online tool that any person can sign up for and launch large distributed denial of service attacks with no technical skill. And these have been around for a few years, but they haven't been highly researched or publicized until recently. So if you look at this diagram to give you an idea of how the stressor works, the person simply goes to a website, and some have free services. Most you pay $5 to $10 a month. Then you enter the attack address, either the domain or the IP address you want to attack. The domain sends the attack to what they call the back-end server. So it's a separate set of servers, which then send a spoofed attack with the target's IP address masked. So the attack is actually reflected off of open internet servers, primarily DNS servers, NTP servers, and charge-in servers. So this does two things. It not only masks the source of the attack, it significantly amplifies the attack. And as you'll see in a few slides, some of the amplification factors can be as much as 500%. So as Dr. Holt coined the term cybercrime as a service, this really meets that definition. So the few news articles that have been out recently, you can see a couple here where some DDoS operators were arrested, as well as the number of attacks that are launched by these stressors. But most recently, I'm proud to say it was my office working with the FBI. We arrested an individual in Akron for using a stressor to launch large DDoS attacks against not only DoD but also the city of Akron and a bunch of the Ohio State Police, significantly impacting their operations. And my office also seized the web stressor, which was a online stressor in conjunction with 17 European countries. We seized the domain and shut down the web stressor. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Holt for some more background.
Sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. In terms of research, as Colonel Hyslip just mentioned, there's not a lot of research regarding booter and stressor operations. Most of the work that's been done has focused on the technical aspects of the attack and how individuals are paid for their service. So the three studies listed here, Karimi, Santana, and Rossau, all examined attack traffic. So specifically looking at the way in which individuals can complete the attack using different methodologies. Is there trouble hearing me? Okay. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. So these researchers utilized live attacks by stressors to examine what is occurring and how they function. Most of it considers the issue of attack trends and traffic. The basic findings tell us that attackers are receiving payments through different means, mostly through traditional resources like PayPal. And that tells us that they're not trying to use anything particularly complicated or sophisticated like Bitcoin. Instead, mostly what we're seeing individual attackers using basic services and infrastructure. The attacks that are there are relatively straightforward and utilize existing processes and methods such as was mentioned previously, things like DNS or other means. There's only been one study to date that has effectively examined the individual operators and those who are the human actors behind the attacks, and that's Hutchings and Clayton. That study tells us that the individual operator are driven by different factors. Some of them are looking to make money, others are in it because of the technical challenge, and some people are doing it for the thrill. So there's a range of motivations for individual actors to engage in stressor operations. What we don't know as well, however, are the individual customers for booter and stressor services. If we think of it like any other service-based economy, there has to be both a supply and demand. So if the suppliers are the attackers, the people who are actually running the infrastructure, what does the demand look like? What do the customers want and how do they do it? So if we can go to the next slide. that gives us a basis to ask the questions that we're interested in. Specifically, what is driving the customers? What is their interest? And so we developed a database of known stressors, and these are the individuals listed here. So DDoS City, device stressor, Galaxy booter. What's important to note is that the name stressor or booter is not necessarily evocative of anything other than just different terms. So initially, the idea of being a booter means that you could boot websites offline. Alternatively, some people use the term stressor in that you are stress testing your individual website server or resource from attack. So the individuals who use stressors are using the same infrastructure as booters, they just have a slightly different terminology. So realizing that, these are the 15 stressors that we were looking at and trying to develop a basis for understanding what the customers look like. And using these baseline groups, we were able to find customer-based registration for these individual operators. We were able to find a cracked database of customers for multiple vendors and see what's happening. And we went through that list of emails and customers and pulled out every single instantiation of an email address. So as you can see here, that gives us 51,909 different user email addresses. That's not to say that these are 51,000 different people, just different email addresses. And the majority of them are coming from, similar to the fact that these guys are paying via PayPal, most of them are using existing traditional email addresses. So Gmail, Hotmail, and Yahoo being the most common. You can see at the bottom that there's some mail.ru and some yandex.ru, but they're very small proportionally relative to the rest. So that tells us we're looking at a diverse group of individuals. These may be throwaway accounts, but they're at least using existing infrastructure that could be examined by law enforcement and others. And so going to the actual survey itself, we used that baseline of email addresses to send out a survey to the potential users, asking them to complete a survey, and 43,000 of those messages went out. We got some bounce backs from the addresses indicating that they were no longer live or managed, or they'd been deleted. We had 5,226 verified as receiving and reviewing the message that was sent. So of those who received it, we had 821 people complete the survey. The good news is that we can go through and look at the individual responses. We then sent out a separate set of follow-up requests to individuals to complete the survey. And the survey itself was relatively straightforward. We had 23 questions for them to complete, involving multiple issues related to either customer skill, their use of the infrastructure, the way in which they paid for the service, the targets that they planned to attack, and then a little bit about their attack types. So what did they pay for? Was it a DNS attack? Was it some other type of protocol? And then how does that correspond to what we can find in the existing literature about the attacks? As I mentioned previously, since there's been some technical research already, we can see how the individual customer's knowledge of what they paid for corresponds to what we see in the existing literature. And then lastly, we wanted to understand the demographics of the user. As was mentioned at the top of the presentation today, there's a lot that we assume about the hacker community, mostly that they're male, that they may or may not have received a formal education, that they're skewing younger, and that the individuals who are involved are going to come from certain countries, that there's differences in interest based on where a person is. And so we wanted to know how much the individual users of booter and stressor operators correspond to that literature. The idea that hacking as a service, paying someone to engage in an attack on your behalf, simplifies the process of hacking means that these could be very young people who just have some money to pay for the attack, or for different means. And so this gets us to a little bit of an understanding about how and why individuals are using stressors. And so that gets to the basic hypotheses of this study. First is that we were expecting the users to be young, primarily white males, given that research tells us expect to find about 15 to possibly 20% of individuals who are engaged in hacking to be female. So young, male, and we were also expecting there to be a higher proportion of users who were from the United States, given that booter and stressor operations so far have involved either the United States or the UK from a law enforcement investigation standpoint. We assume that's where most of the clients are coming from. Then in terms of the account usage, since we asked people how many different stressors they used, we assumed that there would be fidelity to a provider. So based on the email addresses that we were able to collect across different services, that seems like a reasonable basis for understanding. But we gave the individual respondents the opportunity to indicate how many different service providers they used. Then we wanted to look at targeting. As I mentioned, the idea that a booter is referred to as booter because you can knock someone offline, research tells us that the majority of booter and stressor operators initially got started by targeting gaming servers. So you could knock off your opponent in order to succeed. Or if they beat you afterward, you could attack them as a revenge. So that was our agenda here, to understand who they were targeting. Or in the event that they're using a stressor or a stress tester, the assumption would be that they were going to be targeting themselves as a means of examining how their infrastructure was able to withstand an attack. And then lastly, that gets us to motivation. They wanted to either impact a fellow gamer or their opponent in an online system, or to basically test their own infrastructure. So this gives us a lot of latitude to address different issues. Our assumption is that these would be the primary motives reported by individuals involved in this scene. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colonel Hyslip to talk a little bit more about the examples of stressors.
So when we sent the survey to the users in openness and transparency, I used my real email and explained who I was and why we were doing this survey. In hindsight, that was a mistake. Shortly after sending the batch of emails, Mr. Adam Mudd, who is now in prison, but at the time he was awaiting sentencing, called me at home one evening. So that was an awakening. And then shortly thereafter, within a day or two, Mr. Omari, who you may remember him back when the Lizard Squad had their Lizard stressor out, he was their spokesman and was on the news quite often. He also reached out to me to ask some questions. So needless to say, I was a little nervous that I may be a victim of swatting at that point, but everything worked out fine. But in hindsight, in the future, I will be open with my surveys, but I will use a generic email and not provide my real name when dealing with potential cyber criminals. So with that, the first email was sent out, and it was an embedded. The first question was embedded in the email, and to try to entice the individuals to answer the questions, we kind of played on their ego to ask them to provide what their knowledge or skill level is. And 30% of them responded that they were experts. However, another 16% responded that they were, knobs, newbies, unknowing, which goes along with the cybercrime as a service. You really do not need any expert skills in order to to use a stressor. And then after they answered the first question, it took them into the full survey, and we'll go through the questions now. In the second question, we asked if they ever used a booter or stressor. So we asked their skill level, but did they actually use one? And as you can see, the vast majority, 80% or so, said that they did use a stressor. And then we asked did they pay for a stressor. And you can see that 142 of the 230 that responded to that question did pay for a stressor. And from our previous research, we were aware that... Yeah, I'm getting an echo too, John. But
Okay, that's
okay,
better.
that's better.
Nope.
Nope.
So
So 76%
did not pay,
which does correlate to the free services that were available. And when discussing how they paid, as previous studies had shown, at the time of this survey, PayPal was the majority payment processor. However, since then, because of some previous research that Dr. Holt mentioned earlier, PayPal has been working with those researchers to intervene on stressor operators. So we've seen a significant increase since then in the use of Bitcoin and a significant drop-off of PayPal. I'll turn it over to Dr. Holt to continue with some of the responses.
Sure. So with that in mind, we asked them a little bit about their actual use of the stressors or the booters that they worked with. So we wanted to know if they were able to test the system before they used it in full. Given that the research tells us this is a fee for service, one of the things that we know is that individuals in this underground economy of cybercrime as a service want to know if what they pay for is functional. So if I'm buying credit card numbers, for instance, how many of them are checked, valid, and ready to use? And we wanted to know how many of the vendors in the booter community were offering tests, how many of them made their product available to clients before they could actually leverage it for a full attack. And so 87% of our sample of respondents said that they could test it in advance. Additionally, we wanted to understand more about how these stressors actually worked. One of the things that's important to note is that if you buy something like a credit card, the assumption would be that you know immediately whether or not it works because you can start to make charges. When it comes to something like a booter or stressor service, if your target's knocked offline, that's the outcome that you want. But that may not happen in all cases. So we wanted to get a sense of how many of these individual customers were able to produce that outcome, to knock their service or their target offline. And our results suggest 74% of the customers we surveyed were able to have their stressor work as per the advertisement. Now, there is some research telling us that the attacks don't always correspond to what a person pays for. So you may have paid for a specific protocol to be used in the course of the attack. The use of different protocols may occur, but if the site is still knocked offline, that's the main goal of interest. So for the customer, they may not be aware of the back-end components, but the forward-facing or front-facing idea that the site or the server is no longer available is key. And so 74% of our sample got the result that they were looking for. We also, as I mentioned, wanted to ask about tests. So how many different servers or how many different systems did you test? How many different service providers did you go with? And our data suggests the majority were testing either one or more than 10. So while we expected there to be some fidelity, the majority of individuals were using a ton of different service providers, and there's a ton of variation here. So we've got individuals along the full spectrum. So that tells us that individuals are going from service to service, seeing what works and what doesn't. There are some who will just use one or maybe two, but the majority go with as many different service providers as is possible as a means to see just how well they work. So that gets to an important hypothesis. They're not just going with one group or one provider only. They're cutting across the entire economy to see what does what. And so I'll pass it back to Colonel Hyslip for more.
Okay,
and as Dr. Holt mentioned
earlier, the type of attack utilized.
You guys, everyone get it? Okay, there it goes. Thanks, Tom. So the type of attack utilized is a broad spectrum based on what the stressor or booter offers. And I can tell you from previous research, there's no set standard. It just depends on the provider. And also, majority, I would say 50 to or slightly over 50%, will claim to have different type tags, but they're actually just using the primary three, as you see on the left of your screen, the NTP, charge in, and DNS server. An interesting one is the Quick, which is a new protocol by Google that is it's still in beta. However, I've never seen it advertised as a test type, or as a attack type, but people reported using it, and it does correspond to previous research that we did that showed Quick being used, even though it was not advertised as a type of attack. Getting into the heart of the study, in looking at potential cyber criminals, this question, what was the motivation behind your use? So you see the bottom three is really supports our hypotheses. We thought it was going to be test your abilities, yourself, research, system testing, and you can see the majority of respondents did say they used it. That's what they used the stressor for. However, the other 4 of the other 5 answers, not including other, show the criminal potential of these services, specifically the hacktivism, attack a business competitor, or hired to do so. And that was surprising to us when we saw the results, that people were being hired to use stressors on others. And given that, we want to do follow-up research to determine, if they're willing to discuss it with us, who they were hired by or what type of services they were hired to attack. Along that line also was, what did you use the stressor on? So what type of systems did you attack? And you'll see in these questions, we tried to keep them non-accusatory. Most individuals don't like being called a criminal or asked, did you commit a crime? So we kept the questions rather generic and non-accusatory. So that's thus the wording. I wanted to explain that. But as you see in this answer, again, the game and yourself kind of support our hypotheses that that's the primary use. However, the government web server or website was a surprising answer. The private or commercial website or web server, you can see now that could be taken in multiple ways. It does not mean that they were attacking other people's private or commercial websites or servers. They could have been testing their own website. So you can't read a lot into that question. The business server as well. However, the answers themselves do show the potential for these cyber criminals to use the stressors for malicious means. And then when we talked about the number of accounts, based on the email analysis, we thought it was going to be 1 or 2 because of the 50,000 or so emails we had. When we analyzed them based on what accounts they were with, less than 300 had more than 2 accounts. So this was a surprising answer compared to the email addresses in the accounts we actually looked at. So 69 of them had more than 5 different stressors, accounts with different stressors. And I will turn it back over to Tom for a bit.
Sure, thank you. So this gets to a kind of interesting question as well. One of the things that we wanted to know, given the potential range of sophistication and skill, we were curious how many of the people who were using stressors as a customer may have somehow been involved with the stressor or booter operations as well. So not just a client, but they're also a provider. And surprisingly, a good portion of our sample, about half, had used or had operated their own stressor or booter, which was something of a surprise. We expected there to be a smaller proportion of the individuals who were involved with the operations. And in that respect, we asked some questions as to role. So were they involved with either recruitment or posting ads or having some specific behavior? And in that set, we got 81 individuals who said that they were assisting with the operation. So not just running their own, but also involved with servicing the back end, either advertising or managing or dealing with some of the infrastructure issues. And this is kind of an interesting point. We expect that within a service-based economy, there's going to be a broader pool of people who are just simply using the product, not actually facilitating their operation. So there's quite a bit of variation in terms of what's in this sample, which is somewhat surprising. Given that these are individuals who are also running stressors potentially, we wanted to know how many of them have been attacked by stressor services or by stressor operators. And 182 of our respondents indicated that they've been targeted before. So they're not just simply using these services to attack, they're also being attacked by them, which makes some degree of sense if we're looking at people who are trying to, for instance, knock gaming servers offline. If you're targeting someone as a function of revenge, or say you're just tired of them as a competitor, then it's plausible that they would attack you right back using the same method. So seeing that tells us that there's something about this type of product that makes it somewhat different from what we might expect with, say, malicious software or other cybercrime as service tools. In addition, we were wondering about the location of individuals, going back to the primary hypotheses of the study. So we asked individuals to indicate what country they were from, and you can see that the majority of respondents are from the US and then the United Kingdom, but we also have some variation in respondent locations. There is some question, of course, as to the legitimacy of responses. So is it possible that someone could be lying, could be over-exaggerating and saying they're from Mexico because they think that they're going to face a lower risk of prosecution or something else? So there's some potential for false responses in this sample. For instance, seeing a proportion of respondents from Brazil or from Afghanistan, countries that we don't necessarily expect to have a prominent role in this type of economy. So it's interesting, but it is somewhat debatable as to the validity of responses, but it at least tells us we're looking at respondents from Five Eyes countries here, the US, UK, Australia in particular. And in addition to that, when we were asking, whoa, sorry, we went too far ahead. When we were asking respondents about their state, we got a large proportion of respondents indicating that they were from, Tom, can you help me with this one? I seem to have forgotten what our 15th is.
I'm sorry, Tom.
That's
California.
California.
Sorry, they get
a little smaller.
Sure, no problem. So California being our primary response category, but you can see we've got a wide range of respondents from across the U.S. Now, the extent to which this corresponds to ongoing investigations or takedowns of booter and stressor services, I can't really say. But it does at least point us in a direction that there may be some geographic distribution across the entire country, which makes sense where we're talking about a service that could be of interest by a range of attackers, and so this would fit within the general confines of what we expect. And I'll turn it back over to Tom to pick it up from here.
Okay.
Continue on.
You see
the range of age respondents. As we expected, it was primarily a younger audience, with the exception of that spike at 27, which we can't, we don't have a way to explain that. However, the majority of respondents were in the late teens and early 20s. And we also had, you see, a minor spike there at 41, and it's only 7 users. However, the graph there kind of highlights the spike. And we had 3 users that reported over the age of 50, but a couple of those we feel were fictitious responses, specifically the 72-year-old. They claimed basically everything under the sun with the responses. They were hired to do so. They attack competitors, attack games. They tested more than 10 systems. And the email address came back to gmail.fr. So, and he said they didn't pay. So it'd be pretty hard to do the things he said without paying. So we, in future studies, we would not use that response. And then the education level, Joe mentioned it in the introduction. You can see that a good majority have graduated high school, and quite a few have college degrees, which was a little surprising, but it does correlate with the age we just saw, where the 27 and 41-year-olds, you're not going to, well, not many people are going to have a Ph.D. or bachelor's degree at 15 or 16, and again, as Tom said, this is it's good data to know, but we can't say with certainty that people were not falsifying their answers. The gender and race ethnicity supported our hypotheses. You can see the majority were male and white, but there were a handful of different races, which shows, maybe it's spreading outside of primarily being a white male hacker community. And in a few slides, you'll see in the cross tabulation we've done between race, gender, and age, how the female and transgender population that responded are more what we'd call a hardcore hacker potentially than just the white males. And this is just a breakdown based between race and gender. Again, you can see the white male is the highest there. We'll move on this to get to the questions here. This cross-tabulation, it kind of supports that these users may have been being truthful in the answers, in that if they ever operated their own stressors and their skill level, it would take quite a bit of skill to operate your own stressors. And you can see the 56 that responded. They were experts, but they also operated their own stressors. So it does lead to some credence that they're being honest in their answers. And this is the slide I was talking about a minute ago, where you can see under female and transgender, 8 of 11 operated their own stressors for females, and 9 of 15 for transgender operated their own stressors. So even though it's an extremely small sample size, you could say that the female or transgender members who are hackers are more legit, as they say in the underworld, hackers. And this slide here cross-tabulates the motivation with how many systems did you attack. And you can see, again, the over 10 was significant in all answers. But as you get down to the more potential criminal activity on the bottom 4 answers, you can see where the lower numbers drop off, and over 10 is more significant. And that kind of also supports the notion that these users are being more truthful, and that they actually could be honest, and that they are committing criminal activity. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tom here for our last couple questions, and then we will get into answers.
Sure. So this crosstab is looking at knowledge or skill of stressors and then their target. And this is pretty interesting. It tells us that the majority of people who are targeting either themselves or game infrastructure or even private or commercial websites are more on the high end. Now, admittedly, most individuals are not indicating they're relatively new or have minimal expertise or knowledge. So there is some degree of concentration toward the higher end of the spectrum in terms of understanding and expertise. But it's important to note that we're seeing higher degrees of knowledge for most forms of targets, primarily targeting yourself or game servers there. Additionally, we looked at knowledge relative to motivation. And we see a lot more variation here in terms of knowledge relative to motive, with a higher proportion of respondents from the sort of midline of knowledge up to the high end, indicating that they were targeting either themselves, which makes sense if you're running your own infrastructure and you want to see how well it can withstand an attack. Even if you're not well versed with a stressor, you might pay for it as a means to see whether or not it works. And the same for research, whether you're targeting yourself or you're trying to build out an understanding of how the stressor works, this would be one way to do it. The idea of attacking a target, though, like say for hacktivism or because you've been hired to do so, here we see a greater concentration of knowledge toward the 9-10 area. So there's more expertise depending on the nature of the target, whereas those with generally little were targeting themselves or possibly another service, like possibly a game server. Additionally, we looked at motive and the type of stressor the target of the stressor. And so here, if we look on the left-hand side, so we've got our what did you use the stressor on, yourself, games, a game server, a business server, etc. We see some correlation with the motivation categories. So if you're targeting yourself, your primary motivation seems to be either research or system testing. Whereas for individuals who are interested in targeting game servers, the primary motive seems to be either affecting a game server or an opponent, or to a certain extent, system testing, or the idea of testing your abilities. So it's plausible that maybe you're attacking a game server, maybe you're trying to run your own game server, and so you want to see if it can withstand an attack. When we get into things like business or private and commercial, there's a much broader range of reported motivations, although again, testing abilities, system testing, research are all high here. But we do see a small proportion that are doing it for either hacktivism or for some type of protest, or in the context of website and web servers run by the government, there's primary categories being system testing or research. So there's a little bit of variation, but it tells us overall there's consistency for some of the motives compared to their target. And that gets us to our endpoint and thinking about future research and ways that we can move ahead using the findings that we've provided here. And one of the primary thoughts that we need is more research. And I realize that's always kind of an academic answer, is we need more work to know what's happening. But in this case, given that booters and stressors are relatively new, they're very under-researched, not only in the computer science community, but in the social science community. There's a lot more information that we need to collect. So some of the data that we've collected here we're using for different methods of analysis. For instance, we have a paper that's under review right now looking at the factors associated with the customer indicating that the stressor did not work. So for those who had a failed stressor attack, what are the individual level factors at play? Is it something related to motive? Is it their understanding or their knowledge of these issues? So that's something that we want to explore further. We're also interested in looking at that motivation issue in greater depth. So are there certain behavioral or attitudinal correlates for motive as well as for targets? And lastly, that issue of stressor operation. That's a very unique thing to understand. Not only those who used it as a customer, but those who also worked as a service provider. So we're going to analyze this data quite a bit more and see what we can do. And I'd like to pass it back to Colonel Hyslip to talk a little bit more about the follow-up surveys and the interviews.
Thank you, Tom. So the final question in the survey was open-ended, and it asked if they would be interested in conducting a qualitative interview with Tom and I to further develop this survey. And of the respondents, 84 said they would, and they provided emails and phone numbers. And so our goal is to attempt to come up with a new instrument and do some qualitative, do some questioning of the individuals to further develop this research and try to use those answers in developing more information in profiling these potential cyber criminals. And so we hope to do that this year if possible, as everyone else is. Everyone's busy, but it seems like a unique opportunity where the individuals who answered these questions are willing to actually be interviewed. And with that, I believe we can open it to questions. I saw the low orbit ion cannon in there. The reason we didn't include that, or probably wasn't responded, because that was more of an individual DDoS tool. You had to download your computer and launch individually, so it wouldn't have been considered an actual stressor that did the distributed denial of service attack. I saw where Tom responded that we did these email addresses were acquired from leaked databases. So these potential cyber criminals attack each other often, and when they are able to gain access to each other's infrastructure, they often post their databases online And so that's where we acquired these set of email addresses from. And I really like the question, and Tom responded, that John answered about the correlation between those that said the primary purpose for using the tool was research and those that said they had a higher level education. We can quickly run that, and I'm going to do that very shortly to see. That's a great question. We didn't think of it. Let's see. Any other questions? The braggadocio and exaggeration. We did to a point, but there's really no way to know for sure. The cross tabulation helped a little bit, and that's what one of the reasons we did that was to see if their answers matched or correlated in different scenarios. So the number of attacks and why they were attacking, their motivation, and for them, I would say they correlated very, they were decent, but we can't say 100% that a few of these people weren't bragging.
There's a question regarding, responses that are skewed toward those using the tools for research. It's possible that's the case, that the individuals who we contacted or who were willing to complete the survey may have thought there's less risk in responding. It may be that some of the individuals who completed the survey did so because they felt that they had nothing legally to lose by doing so, although our expectation is that we will have some real criminal or sort of black hat types in the sample, so that is possible. But it is plausible to argue that there may be a proportion that are doing this because they weren't overtly involved in highly illicit attacks, so that is always a potential limitation of the data. There's another question about operational perspectives in terms of defending the gig and trying to use it for different purposes. Tom, I don't know if you want to talk at all about that.
Well, based on the results we showed in the different analysis we want to do, we're hoping with that and with the follow-up questionnaires that we may be able to develop some type of profile that can help defenders and law enforcement when looking at criminals. But the one area that I think can help with the gig, protect the gig a lot, is the type of attacks that are being used and reported, looking at the different protocols. And, the ironic part of this whole stressor phenomenon is it would be so easy to stop if the internet service providers and other large backbone providers would simply implement, what was it, best practice, I think it's 28, just don't let spoof traffic out of your network. This would be unstoppable. They wouldn't be able to do it. Every one of these stressors relies on using a spoof packet sent out to an open relay server. And if you stopped at your border gateway, spoof packets from leaving your internal LAN, that stressors would be inoperable. However, I know it's been a best practice guideline since I think the late 80s, maybe early 90s, and they refuse to implement it. They say it's too costly. With bounce back, it looked at about 43,000 valid email addresses. Of those 43,000, we confirmed that 5,000 were received and opened. So it may be from that number, 38,000 chose not to open the email, or they were just burner emails that never got checked. Of those 5,000 that were received and opened, 800 responded in some way. A lot of the people didn't answer the full survey. They picked and choose some questions they answered. But for the most part, it's about 200 answered the full survey. And then there's 50 to 100 more random answers, if that helps answer your question. Well, if there isn't any more questions, we've got about 5 minutes. Joel, you want to jump in here? You got anything to close out with, or any questions you saw that we didn't get to?
I do. I was interested in, you had said you had been contacted by some less than savory characters. Did you hear from anyone who was more interested in kind of the research side? I've always found it fascinating that the term hack had come out of MIT in the 1950s, and for a long time has had a very positive connotation. It makes you think of life hacking a novel solution, kind of MacGyvering. And I'm curious if anyone with that kind of ethos had contacted you outside of the scope of the survey.
I did receive quite a few emails asking about the research, what it's going to be used for, why we're doing it, will it be available, to review. So I did receive, I would say maybe 20 or 30 emails to that effect. Other than the two people calling me, I received, I would say, hundreds of emails that people were not happy that I contacted them, and not such nice language. They told me to not email them. So,
well, Tom and Tom, thank you so very much. This has been fascinating. Here in a minute, we'll have a slide that will have my contact information on it. If you haven't gotten your question answered, or if you come up with one later on, please contact me and we will pass it along to our authors. And just as a closing note, I want to mention a couple of services that HDIAC offers. If you have a more involved question, in part as a result of today's webinar, you can submit what we call a technical inquiry. You can go online to do this. We provide up to 4 hours of free research services in answering such a question, provided it falls within one or more of our focus areas. And our technical inquiries have a fairly rapid turnaround time. If your question or project exceeds the scope of our 4 hours, you can utilize our core analysis task, or a CAT. This is how we support research and development within the defense and federal communities. It's pre-awarded, pre-competed, and thus we can begin work on a CAT in as little as 6 weeks after a statement of work is signed and approved. So again, check out HDIAC.org for more information, or contact me directly. And here, when we go to the closing out lobby, that information will be on the screen, and you'll be available to download the slide deck from today. And thank you again to everyone for attending, and to our two esteemed presenters. This has been most informative.